Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 71. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 20 and 21 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of goodness and malice in external human actions, and of the consequences of human actions by reason of their goodness and malice. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether goodness or malice is first in the action of the will or in the external action. When it comes to theft, is the evil of that action first in the act of willing it or in the external action itself? And insofar as the will is the cause of the external act of theft, it is prior to the execution of that act. However, insofar as that external act was first proposed to the will by the mind, which wills what the mind proposes to it, then in this way, at least in the mind, the external act, along with the moral goodness or evil of its kind, came prior to willing it. Aquinas, combining these considerations into one, writes, the external action is the object of the will, inasmuch as it is proposed to the will by the reason, as good, apprehended, and ordained by the reason, and thus it is prior to the good in the act of the will. But inasmuch as it is found in the execution of the action, it is an effect of the will and is subsequent to the will. Article 2, whether the whole goodness and malice of the external action depends on the goodness of the will. And we can confidently respond to this article in the negative because, as we mentioned in the last episode, evil is always a privation of the good which is proper to something, whether it be in regard to that thing's being or its actions. And privation is found in action, either in regard to its intended end or its object or its circumstances. And if there be a defect in any of these areas, the act cannot be called good, like blasphemy for the intention of saving one's life, where although the intention might seem good, the object is not, and therefore neither can the action be. Or for the Catholic to eat meat to nourish his body, which seems fine, unless it is a Friday during Lent, which in that case would tarnish the action by its surrounding circumstances. Therefore it is not the case that the whole goodness and malice of the external action depends on the goodness of the will. Article 3, whether the goodness and malice of the external action are the same as those of the interior act. Here Aquinas likens the relationship between the internal action of the will and the external act to the relationship between matter and form, which we described in the first volume of the Summa, that similar to how the soul gives actual existence to the matter of one's particular body, so too the interior act of the will gives goodness to the external action which flows from it. And it's a good analogy, especially from the perspective of our last article, because just as some kinds of material cannot receive certain forms like water being ignited, so too things like adultery or killing the innocent can never be made morally good, no matter what the intended end happens to be. They are just evil in themselves. But going back to our present article, if the external act and internal act are ordered to one another, like bad tasting medicine for the sake of health, then there would only be one goodness in the act, and as coming from the end. But if the external action also has some aspect of goodness itself, like pleasant tasting medicine, that's Aquinas' example, for the sake of health, then there would exist an aspect of goodness both from the willed end as well as the external action. In Aquinas' words, when the external action derives goodness or malice from its relation to the end only, then there is but one and the same goodness of the act of the will, which of itself regards the end, and of the external action. But when the external action has goodness or malice of itself, i.e. in regard to its matter and circumstances, then the goodness of the external action is distinct from the goodness of the will in regarding the end. Article 4, whether the external action adds any goodness or malice to that of the interior act. Aquinas will argue that if the external act added nothing to the interior act, we might rightly ask, then why was it done? The external action of almsgiving, as the term and goal of the internal act of the will related to it, is the crowning end of that intended end, and in this way completes the interior act of the will, which would be imperfect if not given the opportunity to carry itself into action, though this would not be considered an evil if the external act could not occur through no fault of one's own. Aquinas will then go on to say that an external act can make the will better in some ways, first by number, since the external action can be intended but not actually carried out, then carried out at another time, allowing for a kind of doubling of the act of the will. Second, by extension, and that one may encounter obstacles in the carrying out of an external action which might require a longer lasting and thereby better goodness in the will to bring it to final completion. And then finally, by intensity, as Aquinas says, for these are certain external actions which, insofar as they are pleasurable or painful, are such as naturally to make the will more intense or more remiss, and it is evident that the more intensely the will tends to good or evil, the better or worse it is. Article 5, whether the consequences of the external action increase its goodness or malice. Do the consequences which later resulted from my external action then retroactively affect the moral character of that action? And if the consequences were foreseen and in that way willed, then in willing the actual thing that I did, the consequences can increase the malice or goodness of that action. But if the consequences were not foreseen yet resulted via the nature of the thing that I did, then also in this way consequences can add goodness or malice to the action, as St. Thomas says. For it is evident that an action is specifically better if better results can follow from it, and specifically worse if it is of a nature to produce worse results. However, if the consequences of my action were not foreseen and did not result from the nature of the act, but only accidentally or unexpectedly, then those consequences would in no way affect the moral character of my action. As Aquinas writes, the consequences do not make an action that was evil to be good, nor one that was good to be evil. For instance, if a man gives alms to a poor man who makes bad use of the alms by committing a sin, this does not undo the good done by the giver. And in like manner, if a man bear patiently a wrong done to him, the wrongdoer is not thereby excused. Article 6, whether one and the same external action can be both good and evil. And the example we are given in this article is a man continuously walking, that although this external action can be the same throughout the distance he traverses, its moral character can change, and this because of his intended end. If a man is walking east with the intention of murdering someone in that direction, but then halfway changes his intention to instead reconcile with his enemy upon arrival, then the one and same external action, the journey, which began a morally evil one, has become a morally praiseworthy one. So in response to our article, we can affirm that it is true that the one and same external action can be at once evil and then at another time good. Which brings us to question 21 of the consequences of human actions by reason of their goodness and malice. Article 1, whether a human action is right or sinful insofar as it is good or evil. Beginning with the definition of sin, Augustine says, sin is a word, deed, or desire in opposition to the eternal law. Our present article is asking about the relationship between evil and sin, along with the relationship between good and right. And the answer is that good and evil are broader notions than right and sin, and that they apply not only to action but also to being. For a man who suffers pain or suffers from blindness, these are evils, but we wouldn't call them sins. Sin and right have to do with action specifically, and at the very least, even if they only make it so far as the doer's intention, as our Lord said, everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So since evil in action is due to variance with right reason, which is governed by the eternal law, and as known by our natural powers, which is the natural law, setting aside divine revelation and faith for the moment, then insofar as a man departs from reason, he departs from the eternal law, and in this way sins. In this way, evil action meets the definition of Augustine for sin, a word, deed, or desire against the eternal law. Article 2, whether a human action deserves praise or blame by reason of its being good or evil. In a word from St. Thomas, an action is said to deserve praise or blame from its being imputed to the agent, since to praise or to blame means nothing else than to impute to someone the malice or goodness of his action. Now, an action is imputed to an agent when it is in his power, so that he has dominion over it, because it is through his will that man has dominion over his actions. Hence it follows that good or evil, involuntary actions alone renders them worthy of praise or blame, and in such like actions, evil, sin, and guilt are one and the same thing. Article 3, whether a human action is meritorious or demeritorious insofar as it is good or evil. And what we mean by meritorious and demeritorious is worthy of reward or worthy of punishment. And since every good deed a man does to another benefits or is a profit to him, and not only to that man, but also through that man to the society in which he resides, because we live in community with one another, and the quality of the community affects the individuals within it, then both from the perspective of the individual as well as the society at large, the doer of good has been of benefit and therefore justly deserves a reward or recompense. It also works in the opposite way. When evil is done, it justly deserves demerits or punishment, which is why injured people feel they have the right to revenge, as well as society as a whole will repay a man for his evil, in some cases by imprisoning him or putting him to death. Then as a final word, a man also rewards or punishes himself in the very act of doing good or evil, because our actions also affect ourself by creating, increasing, or decreasing the good or evil habits which we possess. Article 4 in our final article, whether a human action is meritorious or demeritorious before God, according as it is good or evil. Since a good action is worthy of reward and is good precisely because it is an action willed according to right reason, and since right reason dictates that all particular willed goods be subordinate to the ultimate good, and all particular goals be subordinate to the ultimate goal of all things, which is God, then any action not directed to God in some way as its last goal and end is evil and therefore worthy of punishment. And because such evil not only transgresses God, the legislator of the eternal law, but also injures the universal community of creatures of which we ourselves are a part of, then because God is the governor of that community, it is also his prerogative to administer punishment to those who have caused injury within it. And therefore we must answer in the affirmative to this article that a human action is meritorious or demeritorious before God accordingly as it is good or evil. And that brings us to a close of questions 20 and 21 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of goodness and malice in external human actions and of the consequences of human actions by reason of their goodness and malice. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.